Welcome back to another episode of Prosex Studio. I'm Brian Downs, and today we're talking about the 2001 romantic comedy smash hit, Bridget Jones's Diary. What attitude about sexuality is this movie presenting? Now, if you're watching the channel, you know that my theme is that popular culture and popular media is feeding you a diet of sex negativity all the time. It's fascinating to me that a lot of people think we live in a culture that's too sexually permissive when in fact we live on sexual lockdown. This is a neo-Victorian age where sexuality is presented as a horror show, as sin, and synonymous with murder in many cases, by big budget blockbusters and by video favorites like Bridget Jones's Diary. Well, no murder in this movie, spoiler alert. But still, doesn't work out well for sex. Renee Zellweger is Bridget Jones, a woman 32 years old, English, living in the United Kingdom. And we open with her reluctantly attending a New Year's Day party at her mother's house. And in her voiceover, she tells us that she is afraid that her mother will try to hook her up with yet another middle-aged bore. And as soon as she walks in, her mother lets her know that the Darcys are in attendance, the Darcy family, including Mark Darcy. Bridget apparently knew Mark when they were children, but hasn't seen him in many years. Bridget thinks, here we go. The first 2 minutes of the film are about getting hooked up, about the possibility of sexual relationships, and Bridget regards the whole process with dread. Not off to a promising start. And we're not 3 minutes into the film when Bridget, going into the party, encounters someone she calls Uncle Jeffrey, although he is not and she is 32, who is leering at her and patting her ass. He has no other purpose in this film. This character will do nothing but leer at her and pat her ass at two separate parties. That's it. He doesn't have any function in the plot. He doesn't provide important exposition. He's just the weirdo, the creep, the handsy guy, and this is negative meme number 5. It's villains who sex. I've got 12 negative memes that are recycled endlessly in movies and television to reinforce the idea that you should be fucked up about your sexuality. It's villains who sex, and very often they are villains because they sex. What's villainous about this guy? Well, he's not Dr. Doom, but he's certainly repulsive. We don't like him. Why? Because he demonstrates his sexual interest in Bridget, which is weird and gross. He is weird and gross. But notice that we don't start the film with someone who's attractive demonstrating their sexual interest. But then she is introduced to Colin Firth's Mr. Darcy. This movie obviously owes a huge debt to Pride and Prejudice, which is a much better work of art all the way around. The encounter is very short, very embarrassing, and completely unsuccessful. And moments later, she overhears him remark to his mother, "Mother, I do not need a blind date, particularly not with some verbally incontinent spinster who smokes like a chimney, drinks like a fish, and dresses like her mother." This leads Bridget to make a number of New Year's resolutions, among which is not to fantasize about her boss, Daniel Cleaver, played by Hugh Grant at his most charming in the early 90s, because he is a very big jerk, a megalomaniac fuckwit, about whom she fantasizes, or has to remind herself not to fantasize. This is negative meme number 3, your problem is sex. When a hero and a protagonist is interested in sex, pursues sex, desires sex, has sex, that's their problem. That's what's wrong with them. That's what they need to fix. There's also negative meme number 5, already mentioned. It's villains who sex. When protagonists are interested in sex, it's something they need to overcome, something they need to fix, something they need to leave behind them. When villains engage in sex, it's because they're villains. By the way, the movie shows us nothing from Cleaver to justify Bridget's low opinion of him. Not at this point. There aren't rumors about him. We don't see him being rude to people or anything like that. And although Bridget has resolved not to fantasize about him, she is within a few minutes of screen time returning his flirtations at full speed. Again, your problem is sex. This is going to be a mistake. She's even going so far as to imagine their marriage. They're soon having dinner together, and Cleaver tells her that Mr. Darcy is not a very nice man because he slept with Cleaver's fiancée, destroying Cleaver's relationship with his fiancée. So now that we know that Darcy is a villain, a real villain, a first-class villain. Why? Because his first social encounter with Bridget was standoffish? No, because he's had sex with someone. It's villains who sex. But this is a lie. It was Cleaver who actually banged Darcy's wife, ruining that relationship, but Cleaver's keeping that to himself. You see, Cleaver will turn out to be the villain. Why is he the villain? Because he has sex with people. Now, again, let me be clear. Cleaver's sexual behavior is not good. You should not interfere in other people's monogamous relationships. If two people are in a monogamous relationship, you shouldn't interfere with it or attempt to have sex with one of them. If you are in a monogamous relationship with someone who's expecting you to be monogamous, you should be monogamous. My own opinion is that monogamy is a recipe for unhappiness, but if you are going to be in a monogamous relationship, you should be in one. That's what you said you would do. So Cleaver's behavior is bad, but remember that everything you see here is constructed by the filmmakers. Cleaver's behavior regarding sex is bad, and that's why he's a bad person. All the sex you see is bad. Bridget doesn't know that Cleaver is lying about Darcy and what happened in the past, so Bridget starts having sex with Darcy, and we have a brief sex montage, which, in spite of the R rating of the film, is very PG-13. The two of them are in bed, covered in a sheet. You know, camera cuts to them just as he's kind of rolling off her with that. That was nice. And then they start having a conversation. She's wearing a bra. But Bridget does seem to be enjoying the sex she's having with Cleaver. And in that scene where she's wearing a bra and they're in bed together, the phone rings and Bridget answers it and says, you know, Bridget Jones, wanton sex goddess with a very bad man between her thighs. Notice the language. Not a sexy man. You know, not a tempting man. Not a handsome man. A bad man. Sex is bad. And well, it turns out, of course, it's her mother who's calling, so Bridget is immediately embarrassed. This is the wanting disaster, negative meme number one. Having sex, wanting sex, engaging in sex is followed by a disaster. Now, that disaster is sometimes caused by the sexual encounter and sometimes not, but the disaster does follow very quickly after, which is designed to condition you, much like Pavlov's patient, to be anxious about sexuality. So, jump to a scene where Bridget says in voiceover, it is a truth universally acknowledged that the moment one area of your life starts going okay, another part of it falls spectacularly to pieces. Again, we go from the I'm enjoying having sex with my new lover montage to catastrophe. But this catastrophe is about her mother. Bridget discovers that her mother has lost her mind, taken a job outside the house in a department store, and is now complaining about the 35 years she's been married to Bridget's father and saying if she had to do over, she probably wouldn't have her children. Bridget's father seems to have been a loyal provider for 35 years, but never mind, he's a schmuck. And Mom complains that she has no real power, no real career, and no sex life. That's important. And now she's running around with this jerk named Julian, who is a personality on Home Shopping Network, and is telling her that she has real potential to be his assistant, and she in fact lands that job, the assistant on the Home Shopping Network, with this jerk off. Julian. What's the problem? She didn't have a sex life. What is she doing with Julian? Pursuing sex. Your problem is sex. Pretty quickly, it's a brisk little film, Bridget catches Lara from the New York office naked in Daniel Cleaver's bathroom. So, oh my goodness, Daniel has been carrying on with Laura, or at least in this instance has slept with Laura, who is spectacularly good looking and American and everything that the plump little Bridget is not. Bridget is heartbroken. Number one, the wanting disaster. Bridget wanted to have sex with Cleaver. Bridget pursued such a relationship. Bridget was enjoying that relationship, and now she is stabbed in the heart. A few minutes later in screen time. But there's more, because Bridget will discover that Daniel has been involved with the spectacular Laura for some time. They got to know each other when he was working in the New York office in the past, and now they are engaged. So Bridget cannot stand the sight of her boss anymore and quits her job in publishing and very quickly lands a job in television. Seems a little hard to believe, but there it is. A leap from the publishing industry to the television industry, and now she's an on-air personality for a news program with no experience. But hey, alright, let's keep going. And the very first thing that happens in her new job that she's so excited to have landed, it's a big triumphant moment when she gets the job and walks out of her old job, but the first thing that happens at that job is she winds up showing her butt to all of England in an on-camera mishap. Her triumphant career change leads immediately to sexual humiliation. There are a couple of twists and turns in the plot, and then Mr. Darcy winds up at a dinner party at Bridget's place, and Bridget starts to think that she likes him and they have some chemistry, but Cleaver suddenly reappears begging for forgiveness and reconciliation and explaining that Lara dumped his dumbass. Darcy doesn't like this. He loses his temper and he and Cleaver have some comical fisticuffs, and Bridget decides that she doesn't want either of them. Bridget's parents reconcile, hooray, although their sex life seems to be as non-existent as ever. In the earlier part of the film, before Bridget's mom went nuts and ran off with Julie in the shit, she was complaining she had no sex life and we didn't see any kind of sex life between her parents, and then she returns and expects Bridget's father to simply take her back, which he does, played by Jim Broadbent, who's always terrific. But they don't have any sex life. This is another negative meme, celebrating celibate marriage. Marriages in movies and television are often presented as lacking all eroticism and all sexuality. Bridget's mom specifically leaves. One of the reasons she cites is she has no sex life with her own husband. Then she goes and has some sex with somebody else and comes back and expects to be, welcomed with open arms to a marriage that is apparently as sexless as it ever was. Movies often present marriages, the marriages we're supposed to support, as being without eroticism or sex. So Bridget's mom is back and she winds up bringing up Mr. Darcy again in kind of a by-the-by story because, again, Bridget and Mr. Darcy knew each other's children and Bridget's mother knows Mark's mother. And incidentally tells the story of how Darcy got divorced, which in short is that Cleaver banged Darcy's wife, and that's how they got divorced. So this story that Bridget has believed that Darcy slept with Cleaver's fiancée is revealed as not true. Bridget's a little bit of an idiot. It was Cleaver who told you this story in the first place, and he's been shown to be totally untrustworthy and also a big jerk. So yes, possibly, it'd be easy to imagine a situation where Darcy may have slept with the woman that Cleaver was engaged to, except it might have been a situation where Cleaver had behaved so badly with her that situation was disintegrating. That relationship was disintegrating already. In any case, Bridget suddenly realizes, my goodness, I shouldn't have trusted some story that Daniel Cleaver told me over drinks one night. So she rushes off to try to launch a relationship with Darcy. But here's an important point about that story her mother tells. Well, her mother is saying, oh yes, well, he came home one day to find his wife going at it with a friend of his that he'd been to school with at Cambridge, and it's a terrible scene. And Bridget apparently is imagining the scene because what we see, the camera cuts to an unseen man coming into a house, turning some keys, walking into a room and seeing two people having sex on the floor, the woman on top of the man. We see two people who are clearly nude. Now it's from a PG-13 angle and it's only for a moment, probably less than a second, but it's still the most sexually explicit moment in the film. Bridget's imagining of this painful and shattering thing that happened to Mr. Darcy. We get to see naked people, one bouncing on top of the other, in a scene that's meant to convey pain and heartache. We do not see that when Bridget's having sex with Cleaver, for example. There are a few more twists and turns, but Bridget and Mr. Darcy wind up together. In the end, Mr. Darcy decides to turn down an important and lucrative job in New York to commit to a relationship with a woman who he hasn't spent more than 45 minutes with in the last 30 years. And he comes to her flat in London, and it's snowing, evidently in the winter time. Bridget is delighted that he has come. They go into her flat. He kisses her neck. She excuses herself to change her clothes and freshen up, and this means make herself more sexy, in part by putting on some sexy leopard print panties. But oh no! While she is doing that, Mr. Darcy discovers her diary lying about in the apartment, and the diary is filled with Bridget's now obsolete negative feelings about him. I hate him, that sort of thing. And he marches right out of her flat and down the street, which is the film squeezing in one last wanting disaster. She goes into her apartment with the man of her dreams, who we're supposed to hope that she gets together with. We're supposed to support this relationship. The whole movie is pointing at these two people getting in together as a couple. But he kisses her neck, and instantly we're supposed to believe, no one believes for 1 second, that this is what's happening, that he is rejecting her because of what she's written in her diary. But Bridget races through the snow in her sexy panties and cami, which is sexual humiliation again. She wanted to have sex with Mr. Darcy, and what she winds up with is racing through the snow in her underwear in, down the streets of London to try to reconcile with him. But it turns out that no reconciliation is necessary. He understood everything. He only went down to the shop on the corner to buy her a new diary. Luckily, there's a diary shop 2 blocks away. And they kiss on a snowy street corner in front of other people, which looks kind of uncomfortable and embarrassing for Bridget. And this is important, and I want you to notice this. We don't see Bridget and Mr. Darcy have sex. We never see them in bed together. We see them on a snowy public street kissing. So they are kissing, so there's that. We don't see a scene later where they're having breakfast in bed, half dressed and nibbling on each other. We don't see any of that. We don't actually see a scene where they have sex. We see nothing like the scene where Bridget was in bed with Cleaver earlier. The scene where she's in bed with Cleaver, obviously having just had sex, there are a couple of scenes where she's in bed with Cleaver, is much more explicit than anything that happens with Mr. Darcy. The sexuality is reserved for her going to bed with Cleaver, which was a big mistake because Cleaver is a villain. And we get to see 2 naked people thrusting against each other for just a moment in Bridget's imagining of the nightmare situation where Mr. Darcy discovered his wife in her infidelity. But when it comes to these 2 people getting together, the people we're supposed to be rooting for, there's very little sexuality at all. It looks really kind of embarrassing and uncomfortable. And most of the scene is about Bridget being embarrassed and upset. And then, the camera pulls away from these 2 people kissing, but we don't see anything else of their relationship in this film. I understand there was a sequel, which I haven't looked into. But notice this. The sexuality is for evil people. It's villains who sex. Mr. Darcy does kiss her, but he's wearing a sweater and an overcoat. It's snowing. It's just absolutely the slightest, tiniest bit of sex between the 2 of them just for a couple of seconds as the camera swoops away in the triumphant ending. Because sex is bad. So in the end, this film, like so many films, even though it is was manufactured as, and has been received as very successfully as a charming, romantic comedy, isn't it lovely that these 2 people have come together in this way, isn't really about Bridget's sex life. It's about Bridget's shame life. Bridget makes no reference to any sex life she ever had before the movie started. As far as we know, she's a virgin when she starts. She gets involved with a man who she resolves not to get involved with because he's a big jerk, but she does it anyway. It turns out he's a big jerk. They do have sex. We see them in bed together. Big mistake. Don't do that. Your problem is sex, the wanting disaster. Don't have sex, it leads to a bad result. And then she's really interested in Mr. Darcy in the end. They've spent about 45 minutes together in the last few decades, but clearly they are meant for each other, and he turns down a lucrative job in New York, and they kiss once, but we don't see them go on to have sex. Now, of course, the movie implies these people are going to go have a sexual relationship. The movie wants you to think that, but the movie doesn't show that. So, if you're finding any of this entertaining, please like, subscribe, share it around. Am I revealing some things to you about what goes on backstage in the entertainment industrial complex? Come back next week for more of the same here at Prosex Studios. Thanks for watching.